Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. We're digging into a book everybody's talking about. It's called N.A., Our Biggest Fight, Reclaiming Liberty and Humanity and Dignity.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, but don't worry, it's not as intimidating as it sounds. Basically, this book is all about how the internet, for all the good it's done, has become a little bit, feudal.
Yeah, I think the feudal analogy is a really interesting one. And I think one of the things that makes this book so compelling is that the authors, Frank McCourt Jr. and Michael Casey, come at this from these really interesting backgrounds.
Right, like they've seen both sides of the coin.
Yeah. So you have McCourt coming from the world of business and philanthropy, and then you have Casey, a veteran journalist, and they kind of bring these two perspectives together to really dig into this issue.
So, okay, let's break it down. Digital feudalism. What does that even mean? It sounds like something out of, like, a history book.
Right, exactly. Like knights and castles and, plagues and stuff. But instead, we're talking about algorithms and data centers. It's kind of a fascinating parallel. Remember the printing press, how it could be this amazing tool for spreading knowledge, but also be used for propaganda, depending on who controlled it. The authors are saying we're at a similar turning point with the internet now.
So, are they saying that big tech companies are the new feudal lords?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, they argue that just like serfs were tied to the land, we've become really dependent on these platforms, right?
Yeah.
For connecting with friends, getting information, even making a living.
Yeah.
And the problem is we've given up a lot of power in the process.
So instead of farming the land and paying taxes to the Lord, we're handing over our data, our attention, like our very lives in exchange for using these platforms for free.
Exactly. And the thing is, just like those feudal lords, sometimes it feels like, they could be pretty ruthless, right?
Yeah.
The authors argue that this power imbalance has real consequences.
Right.
They share this heartbreaking story about Walker Ferriel Montgomery, this teenager who was driven to suicide because of an Instagram sextortion scam.
It's awful, but it really highlights how much power these platforms have and how even like seemingly small things online can have these huge real-world impacts.
And it's not just about these like really extreme cases, right? It's also the more subtle ways these systems are designed to keep us hooked, even if it's not in our best interest. Like, remember that study that found Facebook posts that made people angry got shown to a wider audience?
Yeah, no, I remember that. It's like they're rigging the game against us.
Right. And we've become so used to this digital bargain, free services in exchange for our data, that we don't even question it. But the authors asked this really interesting question. Would you give the post office permission to read all your mail just so you could use cool stamps for free?
No way. That's private.
Exactly. But isn't that kind of the deal we've struck with these platforms, though? Like, we're handing over all this incredibly personal information, our thoughts, our relationships, our location, and often we have no idea how it's being used. And the authors argue this is where this idea of digital rights comes in.
Okay, so if we're the serfs in this scenario, what rights are we missing out on? What would it even mean to have more control over our digital lives? So we're talking digital rights, but what does that actually look like? Like, what am I missing out on right now?
Well, think about it this way. You pour your heart and soul into creating stuff online, right? Like sharing your thoughts, photos, videos. Who really owns that?
Good point. Right now, it feels like the platform kind of does.
Exactly. And that's a key point the authors make, this idea of a digital property right. They compare it to Hernando de Soto's work on property rights in developing countries.
Okay.
How even something like an informal settlement, when it's recognized as someone's property, can be leveraged for economic gain. The authors say the same principle applies to our data.
So instead of just being like digital sharecroppers on someone else's platform, we could actually own our data, control how it's used, maybe even make money from it.
Exactly. Imagine if all that data you generate, your online activity, your preferences, even like your fitness tracker data, if all of that could be collectively managed and monetized.
Okay, how?
The authors call these data cooperatives.
Data cooperatives. So like a farmer's market, but for data.
It's more abstract than that, but you're on the right track. Imagine if, instead of just making tech giants richer, your data helped fund your local school or community projects.
Whoa, that's a trip. But how would that even work? Like right now, all my data is scattered across a million different apps.
Right, and that's by design. They want to keep you locked in. But imagine if your data was portable. You could switch platforms easily and take your data with you. No more walled gardens.
That would be a game changer. But if we're not relying on these big companies to store everything, where would all that data go?
And this is where it gets really interesting. The authors talk about decentralized storage technologies like, have you heard of IPFS?
IPFS.
Yeah, it stands for the Interplanetary File System. It's like, think of it like a giant peer-to-peer network where everyone contributes a little bit of storage space.
Okay, so instead of these massive data centers owned by a few companies, we'd have like a more distributed system.
Yeah.
With data spread out across the network.
Exactly. Much harder for hackers to steal data, and even if one part of the network goes down, the rest can keep running.
That makes sense. Kind of how the internet itself was designed to be resilient, right?
That's the idea. And the authors believe, much like the early days of the internet, it's going to take a grassroots movement to make this new decentralized internet a reality.
A digital revolution.
Wow.
So what can we actually do? I'm ready to grab my pitchfork.
Hold your horses.
I don't know.
It's not about tearing down the internet, but building a better one. We need to be more careful about the platforms we use, support companies that share our values, and push for policies that protect digital rights.
Choose wisely where you spend your time and money online. Got it. These big tech companies are incredibly powerful. Even if individuals start making changes, it feels like David versus Goliath.
They do have a lot of influence, it's true. But as the authors remind us, power ultimately comes from the people. Think about any major social movement throughout history. They all started with regular people demanding change.
Okay, that's a good point. But this tech stuff can feel really abstract sometimes. Are there any like real-world examples of how this digital feudalism is playing out right now?
Absolutely. One of the most powerful examples they give is the 2023 conflict in Gaza.
Gaza. Wow. Okay. How does that tie into digital feudalism?
They argue that social media algorithms played a big role in amplifying misinformation and really fueling the fire of polarization around the conflict.
It's like these algorithms were designed to keep us glued to our screens, even if it meant like exploiting a really sensitive and complex situation.
And making it even harder to find common ground, to have nuanced conversations about what was happening. They call it a race to the bottom for our attention.
So what's the alternative? If we want to build a more responsible internet, a more ethical internet, where do we even start? So we've talked about the problems, but what's the way forward? Like, do we need a whole new internet? Is that even possible?
Well, the authors draw this really interesting parallel to the Irish potato famine.
Okay, now that's not a connection I saw coming. Potatoes, internet, what?
Well, they use that story, those Irish immigrants fleeing famine, to kind of illustrate the choices we face now. Like, they were risking everything for the promise of a better life. And the authors are saying we need a similar kind of willingness to migrate to a new internet.
Okay, so pack your bags, everybody. We're going digital, but are we talking about like actually leaving the internet as we know it?
Not literally, of course, but it's more about shifting our mindset, I think, like demanding more from our online experiences and supporting the creation of something better. And, they actually say they believe the U.S., with its whole history of attracting people who are seeking freedom, seeking opportunity, could really lead the way here.
Okay, so like building a new digital nation. I like the idea, but where do we even start?
Well, they lay out a few concrete steps, and the first one is awareness. We've been talking about digital feudalism. Understanding what that means is like step one.
Right, knowledge is power and all that, but then what? Knowing the problem doesn't fix it.
Right, and that's where action comes in. They encourage us to support organizations that are developing these decentralized technologies, like that DSNP protocol we talked about. Think of it like we're investing in the infrastructure of this new internet.
So it's not just complaining about the problem, it's actively supporting the solutions. Got it.
Exactly. And then there's also advocating for policies that promote digital rights. I mean, imagine a world where data ownership is the norm, where you have control over how your information is used.
That sounds pretty utopian, actually. But right now, it feels like those kinds of policies are constantly getting blocked or watered down.
It's true. There's pushback. But, change often starts from the ground up. These big tech companies, they rely on us. And the authors argue that even just by choosing to use platforms that align with our values, we can send a really powerful message.
It's like voting with our clicks and our wallets, right?
Exactly. And it might seem small, but, all those individual actions, they add up. Every time you choose a more privacy-focused app, every time you share an article about digital rights, even just talking to a friend about these issues, like, you're contributing to the solution.
Be the change you want to see online.
That's the spirit. And I think that's a really powerful message to end on, The future of the internet, it's not predetermined. It's being shaped right now, and we all have a role to play.
It's really empowering when you think about it like that. NEW, our biggest fight, it doesn't give us all the answers, but it definitely gives us a lot to think about. It's a call to action, I think. Like, we actually have more power than we realize to shape the kind of digital world we want to live in. So, what will you do to join the fight? That's something to think about. And until next time, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.